Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Today I want to do a little bit of a podcast here. I'm sure those of you who are at least semi-sentient are aware of the new Formula One engine regulations proposal that was unveiled about 5 days ago, last Tuesday as a matter of fact. Although this is a proposal, it does seem fairly clear that Formula One, the FIA, and I dare say Liberty Media have all come to some sort of consensus on what the future of the Formula One technical regulations with regard to the engine specifications should be from the 2021 season. Now, we all have varied opinions, and I mean very widely varied opinions, in terms of what we would like to see as the engine specification in Formula One. A lot of us range from going back to the old days of the V8s, V10s, and V12s running at the same time on track. I'm personally one of those guys. A lot of us liked the 2006 to 2013 V8 engine specification. That was also a pretty good spec, I must say. And then quite a few of us also like the current turbo hybrid power units that we have had since 2014. So what is the FIA proposing here, and what perhaps is the way forward? Well, paraphrasing here from the official Formula One website, the proposal for the 2021 technical regulations regarding the engine are the following. A 1.6-liter V6 turbo hybrid. Now that is exactly what we have had in Formula One since the start of the 2014 season. However, there are some changes coming. We have a 3,000 RPM higher engine running speed, so raising the engine RPM limit, in other words, the rev limit, from its current 15,000 RPM to 18,000 RPM, so plus 3,000 RPM on the rev limit there. That is to improve the sound, according to the official Formula One website. The next item on the list, prescriptive internal design parameters to restrict development costs and discourage extreme designs and running conditions. We'll get back to that one. Removal of the MGU-H. Meh. More powerful MGU-K with focus on manual driver deployment in race, together with option to save up energy over several laps to give a driver controlled tactical element to racing. Meh. Single turbo with dimensional constraints and weight limits. Okay, that's what we've got. Standard energy store and control electronics. Meh. High level of external prescriptive design to give plug-and-play engine chassis transmission swap capability. Meh, big meh on that one. And intention to investigate tighter fuel regulations and limits on number of fuels used. Alright, so that's the proposal. Let's go point by point here and break this down. 1.6-liter V6 turbo hybrid, status quo. That's what we've got since 2014. 3,000 RPM higher engine running speed range to improve the sound. Alright. The current rev limit in Formula One is 15,000 RPM. This proposal is to raise it by 3,000 RPM to 18,000 RPM, which was what we had with the old V8s from 2009 to the end of that V8 era in 2013. The problem with this proposal is the current rev limit is 15,000 RPM. The highest I have ever seen any of these current V6 turbo hybrid engines run is about 13,000 RPM, 2,000 RPM shy of the mandatory rev limit. Now the reasons for this are numerous, however the most important reasons behind this are the way a turbocharger generates its power and the fuel flow limit, which is basically set to 100 kilograms per hour, which is really annoying because basically a Formula One car cannot refuel during a race, but it also cannot burn fuel at any rate that is higher than what the FIA prescribes. This means that the engines can never generate maximum power, even their maximum theoretical power, and they can never rev to the maximum theoretical rev limit, which is 15,000 RPM. The reason behind the teams not hitting the rev limit is because of that fuel flow limit. Above 10,500 RPM, they've got that fuel flow limit, so it really doesn't pay to rev much higher than 10.5. We've been seeing the front runners revving to about 11.5, 11.8, sometimes even as high as 12.5, 12.6, but very rarely have we seen that in the last couple of seasons. Everybody now pretty much sticking below 11.5 in that rev range, so we're still about 4,000 RPM below that actual rev limit of 15,000 RPM. Raising that rev limit at the top end of the spectrum from 15 to 18,000 RPM is going to do pretty much nothing to force the teams to rev the engines higher in order to get the sound better. So that's a loose point in this already. Prescriptive internal design parameters to restrict development costs and discourage extreme designs and running conditions. Okay, this is written basically to stop oil burning that we know Mercedes and Ferrari have been doing certainly this season and probably in parts of 2016, if not even into 2015. However, this is definitely in reaction to that oil burn that's been going on. Basically, Mercedes and Ferrari are getting more power out of a drop of fuel by adding some oil into that mix in the combustion chamber, and therefore helping the fuel to burn more completely, a little bit more cleanly as well, and more efficiently. Formula One engines have surpassed 50% thermal efficiency, at least the Mercedes one has, and I've got to believe that the Ferrari one is not far behind that mark. So we have got some incredibly efficient piston engines in these cars, and one of the ways that they're hitting that efficiency number rather, is to burn oil. So basically, you're going to make the engines less efficient depending on how you define an extreme design and or running condition. Also, with that point, you are killing innovation. Yet again, in Formula One, we're killing innovation because, well, once somebody figures something out that works, the FIA, they all clamor to ban it as soon as possible. I'm talking about active suspension, active aero, traction control, things like that. Basically, think of Williams between 1989 and 1993. You can get my drift there. The FIA have always sought to ban things that have given competitive advantages to teams, even though they were legal when they were designed. So again, we see that trend continuing. Removal of the MGU-H. Right. The MGU-H is a very interesting system, and it's actually beginning to find its way into road cars, which is really interesting, considering that part of the reason that Formula One went for these turbo hybrid regulations was to increase the relevancy of Formula One to road cars. However, we're now getting rid of the MGU-H. Basically, the MGU-H is a generator/motor unit that is attached to the turbocharger, either on the exhaust side or the intake side of the turbocharger, or to both of them via common shaft. Essentially, what happens is you've got this motor attached to the turbocharger, the turbine section of the turbocharger, meaning that it's in constant mesh. It's constantly connected to that spinning impeller, that spinning rotor section in the turbocharger, meaning that as the turbocharger is spinning, that motor can act as a generator in order to harvest electrical energy from the turbocharger. And again, this is energy that would normally be wasted as heat. Or you can have this motor function as a motor and take electricity from an energy store, a big battery pack basically, and then impart it into the turbocharger again to spool it up. So you effectively eliminate turbo lag, all with electronic means. There's no mechanical anti-lag system, as it were, as you might see on some rally cars, for example. This is all done electronically, all done mechanically with that electric motor/generator unit attached to the turbocharger. They want to get rid of that. This could have a few knock-on effects, really, and honestly, I think, again, this is killing innovation in Formula One. The MGU-H essentially has two modes. It can either pipe energy into the turbocharger from the energy store, or it can take energy away from the turbocharger and then basically store it to use later on, either to spool the turbocharger up, or it can then impart that directly into the gearbox through the rear axle and then boost the car accelerating. If you get rid of the MGU-H, you're going to reintroduce turbo lag into these engines, and considering that this is going to be a single turbocharger design, and they want fixed dimensions for that turbocharger, you're going to get into a situation where you're going to have immense turbo lag on these V6 engines. Remember, they're 1.6 liters in displacement, so they're not moving all that much air when you think about it until they really get into the high end of the rev range, wherever that ultimate end of the rev range ends up being. So you're going to have a lot of turbo lag. However, the next point, more powerful MGU-K with focus on manual driver deployment in race, together with option to save up energy over several laps to give a driver controlled tactical element to racing. Alright, so if you're getting rid of the MGU-H, you're going to augment the MGU-K. It effectively operates on the same principle as the MGU-H, however, this is harvesting energy off of the rear axle. Basically, it's using inertia that would normally just be bled off through the brake system, but it's using some of that energy, converting it into electricity, and then storing it in a battery pack for deployment later on. The Kerr system that we had in Formula One from 2009 to 2013 worked exactly on that principle. Those engines were naturally aspirated, so there was no MGU-H MGU-H. There was no turbocharger to speak of on those engines, but the Kurz harvested off of the rear axle, and it used the car's inertia, again, normally just wasted under braking, and it converted some of that energy into electricity for deployment later. They want to bring that system back in exclusivity without the MGU-H and bring it back more so into the driver's hands in terms of being able to use it like the old-style Kurz system. I don't mind that. However, if you're going to have the removal of the MGU-H, that means turbo lag is going to be a thing again. Does this mean that the MGU-K's primary function is not to boost the car in order to give a performance advantage, but really it's just to compensate for turbo lag? I can see the drivers just getting on the throttle and then getting on that MGU-K deploy button just to get the car accelerating out of the corners just so that they can work through that turbo lag. It's not going to be an overtaking aid so much as it's going to be just let's get the car to accelerate a little bit more quickly sort of aid. So already I see some detriments to the racing going on. Moving on, single turbo with dimensional constraints and weight limits. So again, this is a single turbocharger just like we have now. However, they want even more control over it. They want to dictate exactly how much it weighs, and they want to dictate exactly what size it is in all of its dimensions. So yeah, basically you're going to have a single standard turbo. High energy store and control electronics, rather standard energy store and control electronics. Okay, so no more teams developing their own control systems, no more teams developing their own batteries and things of that nature. Essentially, we've got a standard ECU already that's produced by McLaren Electronic Systems, and essentially you can implement any sort of standardized electronics as far as I think most fans are concerned. I personally like the team-to-team levels of innovation and development that we see in Formula One. However, most casual fans, I would say, initially at very least, they don't have much comprehension of what's going on under the skin in these cars because they are just so complex. However, as fans do become more engaged with the sport and they start to do their homework, I will say, Formula One fans, I've talked to many of you out here in the wild west of the internet, and you are all extremely well read on your Formula One history, your technical data, your technical regulations, your sporting regulations. We Formula One fans, once we're hooked to this, we learn as much about this sport as we can. So you can look at it in a double-edged sword, twofold manner. If you standardize those control electronics, okay, you can lower costs, and the casual observer really won't notice. However, to the die-hard, hardcore fans here, that is now another element of the sporting contest that you're removing. So my opinion is divided in that sense on that standard control electronics. High level of external prescriptive design to give plug-and-play engine chassis transmission swamp capability. I have no idea what that actually means in practice. What my interpretation of the wording actually says, high level of external prescriptive design. So basically, you're now saying that the engines all have to, first of all, they need to be essentially identical in a dimensional sense. However, you're also talking about the structural design of the engines, meaning that where the gearbox latches up to the back end of the clutch, where all of the engine mount points are for integrating the engine into the chassis and so on, all of that is now going to be prescribed. So effectively, you're going to be telling all of the engine manufacturers to build the exact same specification of engine. We almost have that now. Of course, the engines all have to comply with the same technical regulations, and they're all allowed to exist within a window that is deemed legal by the FIA. However, at this point, if you want to implement a high level of plug-and-play capability, essentially that means that everybody is going to build exactly the same engine. You're just going to slap somebody else's name on it. That, to me, is absolutely ludicrous. This is Formula One. The teams are constructors. End of sentence. Yes, the teams will continue to build their own chassis. However, the few teams that do build their own engines, they are constructors. They do not conform their designs to those of anyone else. They look at the rule book, they interpret it once to see what it says, and they interpret it again to see what it doesn't say, and then they try their best to outdevelop the rule book. That's how Formula One works. If you basically want to standardize the engine specification across all teams and all manufacturers, then you may as well just bring in a third-party supplier and say goodbye to companies like Ferrari and Mercedes, because just why would they bother to invest all of that time, research, money, and effort if the specification is going to be 95% identical to everybody else. It's not worth it. I think that's particularly bad for the sport. And then the final point here, intention to investigate tighter fuel regulations and limits on number of fuel used. This is also in reaction to the oil burning saga that we have seen this year, again with Ferrari and Mercedes burning engine lubricant oil in the combustion chamber to aid in fuel burn. Basically, what they want to do is also standardize the fuels. Now, the fuels are not standardized right now in F1, but the chemical compositions of those fuels is very, very tightly monitored and very tightly controlled. So, basically, you want standard engines and standard fuel for everybody. At this point, it does look a lot like NASCAR, which is bad, and it leads me to the second major point of this video. Ferrari, in the last couple of days, have threatened to quit Formula One if this 2021 engine reg proposal comes through. Now, we'd have to try and isolate our emotional side from our logical side here if we're going to make any sense of this, because Ferrari and Formula One are pretty well near synonymous. Ferrari exists mostly because of Grand Prix racing, and so Ferrari built road cars just so that he could afford to build more race cars and to go racing. Formula One, since the first round of the Formula One World Championship as we know it in 1950, has had Ferrari on the grid in every single race since. Formula One needs Ferrari just as much as Ferrari needs Formula One. Without a Ferrari presence in Formula One, I would say a good 40% of the global audience will go away, because people know Ferrari and people love Ferrari because it's Ferrari. I don't need to explain it anymore. My channel's called Ferrari Man for a reason. Ferrari has that sort of global recognition. Ferrari needs Formula One for the same reason, because Formula One has that global recognition. You will not find any other racing series on the planet, even very illustrious ones like WEC, for example, that have obviously as the jewel in their crown the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Ferrari do race there, but not as a factory outfit, and when you hear about the Le Mans results, you hear about it on the news one time, and then that's it. You hear about Formula One for decades. We still talk about what happened in the 60s and 70s, not to mention the 1950s. We'll be talking about 2017 for decades to come, I'm sure. Ferrari understand that, and Formula One also understand that. So Ferrari's threat to pull out of Formula One if this 2021 engine reg proposal comes through, it's just that. It's a threat. It's saber rattling. Ferrari are trying to use their immense political influence to leverage the FIA and maybe to leverage Liberty Media as well, because I think Ferrari could see Liberty as, well, they're a newcomer, they don't quite know what they're doing yet, they're still getting used to being the big kids on the block. Let us dictate to you how this cookie crumbles. Ferrari, obviously, have historically been very tight with the FIA and with FOM. Bernie Ecclestone recently has gone out saying that, yes, at times the FIA has acted to benefit Ferrari, because Bernie basically said what I'm saying. F1 needs Ferrari, and Ferrari needs F1. It's a symbiotic relationship. Bernie has even gone so far to say, if Mercedes would lend some help to Maranello, it would be better for the sport. And as sacrilege as that may be, I'm not going to disagree with Bernie Ecclestone there. It's been far too long without a Ferrari challenge for the championship. 2017 is as close as we have come really since 2007. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling that Ferrari have now gone basically 10 years without winning the Constructors' Championship. It's not good for the sport to have Ferrari struggling, and I wouldn't say that they're struggling this year. They've certainly done better this year than they have in the recent past. However, they're still not quite there. Bernie's point there, just as an aside here, I see where he's coming from. It is sacrilege, however, to tell a team, basically to sell themselves out to another team, although we have seen teams do that on their own volition in the past. 2007, Spygate, anyone? Yes. However, I understand what Bernie is saying. The way to do that, though, the way to enhance the spectacle for everybody is not to go the route of the FIA and Formula One management at this point in standardizing the engine specification for the most part. If you want to make the engine sound better, here's what you can do. Twin turbo. Look at IndyCar. I've been to an IndyCar race. I've seen those cars up close and personal. I've been in the garage while they're doing shift checks. Those engines are loud and they sound good. and they're very similar to what Formula One are running. The Indy engine, it's a bit bigger in its specification, it's larger. However, it's twin turbo, meaning that you don't get as much restriction in the exhaust with the Formula One engines being single turbo. All of those 6 primary pipes have to go into a single collector pipe before they can be piped into the turbocharger. You lose a lot of your sound there in terms of its resonance as well as its volume. If you want to make the engine sound better without even having to raise the rev limit, twin turbo, that's the way to go. Part 1. Part 2, to make the sound better, increase the revs. And by increasing the revs, here's what you do. You get rid of the fuel flow limit at 10,500 RPM. You basically say, look, we're not refueling during the race, that's fine. Make your fuel tank as big as it needs to be in order to do a Grand Prix distance. And if you want to do fuel saving, by all means do it. That's what happened after 2009 with the end of refueling. The teams had to make their fuel tanks big enough in order to go a race distance. And we didn't have fuel flow limits, and we had a rev limit, which was done for reliability reasons, but there were no fuel flow limits in that sense. In terms of fuel economy, it was like, make the tank as big as it has to be. And you saw the teams make their cars physically longer in terms of wheelbase starting in 2010 to accommodate the larger fuel tank. So that makes perfect sense. If you want to make the sound better, raise the revs by removing this completely arbitrary fuel limit, which was done in the name of eco-Marxism, in my opinion, and twin turbo. It's a fairly elementary conclusion, and I don't really understand why Formula One is not looking at that as a viable option for 2021. Is it because they don't want to be seen as copying IndyCar? Maybe, but I'll tell you one thing about IndyCar. It works. It works very well. Yes, it's a standard series. Everybody has the same car. Everyone more or less has the same engine. But in IndyCar, what you have, basically, is the sort of engine regulation that Formula One is proposing for 2021. Everything is mostly standard. A team could very easily switch their engine supply from Honda to Chevrolet from one year to the next in IndyCar, and they wouldn't have too many integration problems going between the two engines. Formula One essentially is proposing those same regulations by telling the engine suppliers, here's our specification, build it. Have a nice day. So at this point, Formula One, you're basically going to have a quieter version of IndyCar in 2021. IndyCar's great, it is, but it's IndyCar. Formula One is different. Formula One is Formula One. Formula One is different because Formula One is different. The teams are constructors. They design, produce, and race their own cars of their own design. I mean, and all up and down the grid. Sauber, they race Saubers. They're not racing anybody else's car. It's not like an IndyCar where you've got AJ Foyt and Andretti. They're both racing Delaras. No, you've got Sauber racing Saubers and Force Indias racing Force Indias and Ferrari racing Ferraris and so on. That's what makes Formula One unique, because not too many series have that where the teams are constructors, and it's something that is very important to the heritage of the sport. The engines are part of that. No matter if a team builds their own engines or they get them from third-party suppliers, the engines are also unique, and it's also very interesting to see, particularly in the past now, where you'd get onboard shots from different cars and you could compare the engine sounds and you could compare the performance between them. I remember in 2005 in the free practice sessions, I would always be so intrigued by watching the onboards of Fernando Alonso or Kimi Räikkönen or Michael Schumacher, for example, and listening to the engine notes and remembering, hey, last week that sounded a little bit different. What have they done? Are they revving higher? Do they have a new specification on the engine entirely? What's going on here? And then you see the lap times, and you see, oh, look, they're working here. Maybe you don't know exactly what that development work has been, but you know that they've done something, and you know that you're now seeing it with your own eyes. We've removed that aspect of the competition and that aspect of the intrigue in Formula One, and it's just something that I really miss, and I think a lot of you all miss that as well. It's no accident that to the backdrop of this commentary you're watching some V10 cars pounding around, because of all of the eras of Formula One that I have watched both in real time as well as going back in time and doing my own research and catching up on the last 50 years of history. The V10 era was my favorite. Yes, the V12s, I love them, especially that Ferrari 412 T2. I absolutely love it. It's an absolutely otherworldly sound, but in terms of the performance and the reliability, on aggregate, I absolutely loved those V10s, and I really would love to have them back, but I know that is a pipe dream, although some of you may actually share that pipe dream of mine. However, that's all I've got to say here today about the 2021 engine regs proposal, as well as Ferrari's threat to quit Formula 1. Do tell me what you think about this. I'm very anxious to start a little bit of an open mic session on this and hear all of your thoughts. Until next time, though, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much, and of course we will see you soon.